keep talking.
That's great. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Nick Hool. I work with Gary at Eli, the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. I'll be kind of running point on the tech support and managing the chat as well. So we'll be primarily having a conversation between Gary and our guest, Margie Worthington-Smith today, but we'd also love to include all of your voices whenever we can. So if you have questions throughout, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A function, both of which are along the bottom. And if you could, while we're joining in, as Dr. Greiner and others have been doing, if you could put in your name as well as where you're calling in from and what you're interested about in this conversation about entrepreneurial mindset in education, about its effects on South Africa, whatever it may be. Great, more folks are jumping in.
Yeah. And I see we've got someone from Cameroon. Armand, welcome. Thank you for being here. It's always great to see an international audience, which we'd expect more of with Margie as our guest today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Margie. It's been a long time. We've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gary. I'm also very excited to be able to be chatting to you and to be talking to an international audience too. It's a great privilege. So thanks for having me on.
Yep, and we will record this. Of course, this is going to be recorded. So for those of you who want to, Nick will send out the recorded version of this if you want to use it or watch it later. Okay, here's folks
Jumping in. Katie Holland
Reno.
is saying hello. She's calling in from Reno, Nevada, from Economic Development Agency and former school board president, interested in how to get entrepreneurship into public schools. You have come to the right place. at least to speculate on how to do that. I don't know if we'll be prescriptive, but we'll give you some great ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we've got oh boy, hold on here. Somebody's coming in here. We got Jobert from
Zimbabwe,
up north of Zimbabwe. Awesome. Scaling up entrepreneurship education in my country. Excellent. Awesome. Katerina from Ireland, welcome. Grant.
And I can tell you that Grant, when he says he's a Safa, that basically means he's South African. So hi, Grant. That's what that means.
That's it. What is a staffer means? I'm a South African.
Saffer.
A Safa, South African. We kind of tend to say it all in one thing, and it comes out Safrican, So.
Okay, Saffer. I get it. Okay, thanks for letting me in on that little.
Thank you. Yeah, the little in thing we have. Yeah.
That little inside thing.
Yeah,
definitely. Edwin is chiming in on the Q&A. He's calling in from Zambia, and he has been involved in SMEs, which is similar to what we call in the States small business development centers, as well as with farmers and agro dealers. So Edwin, great to have you with us.
Hi, Edwin.
All right. It seems like folks are slowing down and joining us. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn my camera off for now. And then as questions start to pile in, once the two of you have kind of gone for about 20 to 30 minutes, I'll chime in and we'll try to engage the rest of the audience.
Great. Thank you, Nick.
Yep. Thanks
everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us. Margie, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So let's start from the beginning. Margie, you and I met in Cape Town at the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation, I don't know, 2017, maybe?
2016.
2016. Yeah. Okay, yeah. And you were the former executive director of the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation, which is a large foundation that supports entrepreneurship in South Africa. And we kind of clicked right from the get-go in our mutual passion for the entrepreneurial mindset. And the first question I just wanted to ask you, Margie, is like, how did you come into this entrepreneurial mindset realm? Like, what brought you into this? What lured you into this? What got you on this path? And you've probably been on this path longer than I have, but what got you going on this?
Well, I'll try and give it in a short nutshell because it's not that it's much more interesting to talk about entrepreneurial mindset, but just to give some context as to how I got there. So my educational background is in education. I did a degree in higher education teaching, and I taught for a while in the mid 80s, which in South Africa's history was a very turbulent time. We were under a state of emergency, and the defense force, the army, was basically running the country. And the school that I taught in was in one of the areas that was highly volatile and very dangerous. So it was a real baptism, literally of fire, for me as a very young teacher. And then I went into another school, which was less dangerous, but where I really got some incredibly good grounding with colleagues who were outstanding educators. So that was my background. And then while I was doing that, I had a very close friend and colleague who was a very maverick entrepreneurial person. And one day he walked into my classroom after school and said, "You're out of here, we're going to start an organization." And I was like, "Well, really?" And so he said yes, because we'd both been talking a lot about what was happening in South Africa at the time, which was that some of the apartheid legislation was becoming slowly abolished in the late 80s. And we're allowing a bit more movement of people in the country, because before you had to have passes and so on. I won't go too much into the history of it. I'm sure many people know that, but it was a very oppressive society, and apartheid was a really a very harsh way to be living. And so we wanted to give something back. And as a result of some of these laws, what happened was that people started flooding to the cities to look for work, because at that stage they hadn't been allowed to come to cities, mostly had to stay in rural areas. And so there was this massive burgeoning of communities that needed to generate an income in some way. And so we started a non-profit organization called the Triple Trust, and basically it was to assist people to run their own businesses. And the triple was training, financing, and marketing, the three kind of things we very naively, as our little young people, thought were very important. But in that time, we developed some really cool, innovative training methodologies, which were very low tech, but fantastically exciting and creative. And in fact, as an aside, the ILO ended up using them all around the world in 75 countries and a whole lot of different languages. So that was a fun time that we had there. But in the process of that, I really got to thinking about what was the underlying thing that is the motivating, what is the motivator for somebody to become an entrepreneur? Because those were really survival business people. They were not entrepreneurs in a definition of the word, but they were nevertheless survivalist entrepreneurs making, living for themselves. And so in 1996, I started a kind of offshoot of the Triple Trust called the South African Institute for Entrepreneurship. And that was really where we started looking at the entrepreneurial mindset. And we were really trying to focus on what constitutes what's that kind of golden thread that makes someone an entrepreneur. And so at the time, the South African government was getting rid of the old apartheid education methodology and content, and bringing in new systems. And so it created a fantastic gap for us, because they actually had a little subsection of a subject called entrepreneurship. And we were like, fantastic, we're going to infiltrate the system by designing materials that teachers had to teach from anyway, but we will kind of use the methodologies to try and teach entrepreneurial mindset through this kind of Trojan horse kind of way. Anyway, it was very difficult as a small non-profit organization alongside the Titanic. I did say the big tanker of the education department. We were like a little tug, but we did very well. It was actually amazing, because it was a wonderfully innovative, incredibly entrepreneurial time for ourselves as well. And trialing and testing and trying to find ways but we were not systemic. So it's important for the rest of the conversation to know that we were just one of a number of civil society organizations trying to impact this big system, and really just not making a big impact, but doing what we could as a small little nonprofit organization. And then, as you say, Gary, I went to the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation, which was a wonderful combination of education and entrepreneurship. That's their mission. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is like perfect for me, because it really does bring together the two passions that I had. And that's when we got into long, big conversations about the differentiation between what they call a high impact entrepreneur versus the entrepreneurial mindset, and how does one cultivate and catalyze an entrepreneurial mindset. And then we were really grappling with these. And then I heard you speak and met you there. And I thought, oh my gosh, it feels like when you're seeking for some kind of, in a like say religious context, you're looking for a particular denomination of a church that meets your kind of understanding. And I was like, I found the denomination because it was just
Yeah.
a language that you were talking. And anyway, and then I came to Sacramento to do your training in 2016. And so the rest from our side is history. And then just really quickly to finish the story, I had an incredible opportunity to be part of a very small team that was mandated by the then deputy president in 2011 to look at how do we solve the problem of youth unemployment in South Africa. So that's another whole conversation which we can answer. I'm happy to answer questions on, but that was the motivation behind the establishment of the little unit that I started in 2018 and that I'm now still, very much a part of. And I'll tell you more about that now as we go into the details of it. So that's just my background. Yeah.
That's super interesting. So even when you created like the triple trust thing, like you were young, you were kind of naive,
Very.
and it really wasn't even your own idea. Like somebody pointed it out to you, like, hey, we're going to go do this thing. Like, do you remember like that changing your mindset? I mean, what I'm asking, Margie, is like the experience of actually building something where you were no longer just showing up in your role as a teacher, but you had actually created something that was being used by other people. Did that impact you in any way? I mean, that you're aware of?
Definitely. I I didn't think of myself at all as an entrepreneur at all. I didn't even know the word really. I certainly wasn't defining myself as an entrepreneur. It was only years later that someone said, well, I mean, you are an entrepreneur. And then I was thinking about, there's an amazing article that Roger Martin wrote about social entrepreneurship. And he was making this distinction. It's actually in the Stanford Innovation Review, if anybody wants to look it up. I think it's 2007. And he has this wonderful
Nick will find that.
Yeah, if you can find it, maybe pop it in the.
I missed the name. Could you repeat that?
Roger Martin.
Roger Martin.
Yeah, and it's on social enterprise, I think he calls it. And anyway, and so the point of that is he was really drawing the distinction between how an entrepreneur that with a value proposition of money, it follows exactly the same path, or the social entrepreneur follows exactly the same path, except that the value proposition is a social one. And it got me thinking about how my own journey, about how one sees an opportunity, you kind of seize it, you garner all the entrepreneurial social capital and qualities that you need in order to create a project a product rather, that somehow changes the landscape, that has imitators and that people want. And so when I was like, well, that's exactly what we were doing, trying to change the landscape somehow because of the vacuum that was created by the apartheid system and so on. So we had a great opportunity, because I happen to have been very privileged in South Africa, to pay back and to really find a way of truly trying to empower all South Africans to be to reach this equality that we were trying to do. Oh, well done, you found it. The case for definition, exactly. That's it. So if anybody wants to read it, great article. Yeah, thanks, Nick.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Nick. That's super interesting, Margie. I mean, I think that, the first thing that I wanted to say that's so interesting is so many of the entrepreneurs that I've interviewed over the last 10 or 12 years, they don't self-identify as entrepreneurs.
I didn't, definitely
and
not.
That's really interesting. I mean, so, how do you develop intervention programs in education for people that don't even think of themselves as entrepreneurs? I mean, there's a problem with the word entrepreneur in the lexicon. I mean, you and I have talked about this ad nauseum, and I've used your quote many times in education. When you bring up the word entrepreneur, the English teacher gets up to go make tea.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I have to acknowledge that was not my quote. That was from a friend of mine called Giles Gillette from NLF, who said that. So I have to give him the credit for that. But it was a very apt comment that he made. He just said, people just hear the word, the English teacher makes the tea, which is exactly right. So yeah.
But I think, one of the things that you and I kind of both that resonates with both of us, Margie, is that this entrepreneurial way of thinking, let's call it, is a means of like emancipation. It's a means of empowerment. And I mean, I think that's Would you say that that's a fair statement, that's kind of the message that you and I are trying to infiltrate into the education system?
Absolutely, Gary. I think, again, taking it back to the South African context, we come out of a history of oppression through the years of apartheid and colonialism. And so we have I hesitate to use the phrase because, but I'll just use it. So this kind of notion of learned helplessness. And so I don't want to make that indictment on the country, because certainly that's not the case across the whole spectrum. But there is a culture of waiting for permission. Because under the apartheid government, we definitely were very oppressed, and the laws was what guided, what told you how to be. It's a little bit like COVID is now, actually. But also the schooling system was very, very, very strict. Corporal punishment was the thing, and so we lived in this very waiting for permission-y kind of environment. And that, of course, is totally contrary to the entrepreneurial mindset. And in terms of really being free in a truly free environment, which is really what we all, and Nelson Mandela was his whole life was about us being free. And you can't really be free if you don't realize your own agency and your own autonomy and your own self-efficacy. To be able to say, I can actually do this. I don't have to wait for permission for someone else to tell me. But when you're in an environment that's constrained by permission, then it's an external locus of control, instead of your own ability to say, I see an opportunity, I'm just going to go take it. Oh no, wait, I better ask whether I'm allowed to. So we have that kind of, and so shifting that, I think if we can shift that, we will really make a big difference to the sense of freedom that people have to be able to say, wait, I can solve that problem, which of course is what we're wanting the entrepreneurials, as we call them, to do, is to be seeing problems. And you said this once, Gary, I remember. You can't, and in fact, we've been talking a lot about having one's radar on and autopilot off. If your radar is not on, if you're not conscious and you can't see the problems, then you can't harness all your skills to be able to solve them if you don't even see them. And so we're having a lot of conversation about, is consciousness a competency? There's a question for somebody who's listening, because we're looking at what constitutes the competencies that you're looking for as outcomes of this process. And those, of course, are, collaboration and communication and critical thinking and creative innovation and confidence. And then, is consciousness maybe not also one? So anyway, we're having a nice conversation about that too. But anyway, so yes, I think that you're absolutely right. There's, for us, the sense of freedom is really an important element. Gary, if I can just also go back to something else, which may come up later, but I want to foreground it, and that is that we're very conscious of trying to make a South African sort of bespoke education, or let me say a system, or what we call a teaching for learning approach, which is very appropriate and relevant for the South African context. And so what does that mean? What's generic and what isn't, and what should be bespoke, and so on. And Steve Biko, who was a real amazing leader of ours, who unfortunately was murdered in the 70s by the apartheid government, but he said that Africa's gift to the world is in the space of human relationships, where the West gave us an industrial and a military look. Africa's look, and this was his kind of view. And I think that there's something really powerful about that, because this notion of entrepreneurship can sometimes be problematic when it's looked at through a particular lens of let's say, a capitalist economic system, where what's in it for me, it's about making money for me, it's about running my business, it's about my success. And we are very much shifting away, or trying to shift people's definitions and understanding of that word. And you talked about it just now, about the difficulty of wording and the nomenclature of what does something mean, and how do you shift people's understanding away from entrepreneurship to an entrepreneurial mindset. And so this notion of creating value for others, which is also something we've talked about a lot, brings into the conversation the fact that this empowerment that I was talking about before one becomes empowered in oneself when you are creating value for others. And there's a notion in South Africa and in Africa, which I think I've shared with you before, is this notion of Ubuntu, which really is the idea of I am because we are. So actually we don't do anything as an individual, because we live in a collective. And if we take Steve Biko's wonderful words, where Africa's gift to the world is going to be in the space of human relationships, we really want to try and embed in the system this notion of the humanism of the role of education as a humanistic pursuit, as well as just I'm there to learn subjects and get good grades so I can move on to the next thing. And so we're trying to also embed in the entrepreneurial mindset constructs that we are designing this notion of that intersect between one's interests and abilities and the needs of others as being that real space of where magic and flow happens, but also where community happens, where at the center of that is the we of all the eyes that so I just wanted to share that, because it's really an important element that we are trying to build into our approach.
Yeah, I love that, Margie. I mean, that's definitely like, that's our simpatico, the empowerment component, and we've got a lot of work to do to help the world understand like the broader implications of entrepreneurship, like to think of it beyond the narrow confines of that's relegated for someone who's going to start a business, and but I want to also back you up, Margie, and the learned helplessness thing, like I in agency, like you said something that's really struck me as profound, that you can't be free if you don't have a sense of agency. And if you don't have, a belief in your own ability to navigate life. And I think the learned helplessness thing is a much, much bigger problem. It's much more subtle and insidious. I mean, if you look up learned helplessness, you're going to learn about the experiments that Martin Seligman and his colleagues did in the late 60s, early 70s, shocking rats or dogs in cages, and how they learned to, like, the essence of learned helplessness is the belief that nothing I do will matter.
Exactly.
And I think it's, that phenomenon is much more insidious. It's not just something that happens during apartheid. I mean, certainly, that those are conditions that would certainly lead to learned helplessness. But I think more broadly speaking, the employee mindset is
Exactly.
I mean, there's like deeply held assumptions that someone else is going to tell me what is useful. And
Absolutely.
I'm going to do that useful thing in exchange for a salary or a wage. And one of the things I've done a fair amount of research around this idea of learned helplessness. And to me, the most frightening aspect of learned helplessness is that for those of us who are suffering from learned helplessness, one of the devastating side effects is the inability to recognize a solution, even when it's unambiguously presented.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the work what you and I are trying to do. And how does, I think Nick wrote something about that description of this episode is, in education, I mean, I think more broadly speaking, this is actually a question, I'll try not to be long-winded, but in education, I think, or even beyond education in a broader world, we tend to default to trait-based assumptions about entrepreneurs. There are just some people that are innately born with, scientifically unfathomable traits And we just need to find out who they are and then, you know,
Put the wind
shower
behind
them
their
with,
sails. Yeah.
with venture capital, and something magical will happen. And that's the wrong way to think about it. That's the attribution error, the fundamental attribution error.
Right.
And so, you know, I'm so excited about the work that you're doing specifically in the Department of Education to bring the entrepreneurial mindset into the entire K-12 curriculum.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, and maybe we'll come back to the learned helplessness thing in a minute, but I want to understand, like, what is it that prompted the government of South Africa to do this?
Right. So let me give you a little bit of that part of the history. So I mentioned that at one point I was part of a sort of a task team that was it was really mandated, as I said, by the then Deputy President Motivator, who was very concerned. Now, bearing in mind this is 2011, so it's 10 years ago, at the very high rate of youth unemployment in South Africa, and it's now at 74%. So just to give you some idea, it was like high 40s then. So it's really skyrocketed, which is really, if you just think about that number and you think about the consequences of young people not doing anything, you know, who are unemployed, just the consequences on their own, for themselves personally, for their families, for their environment, for, you know, just the way the society operates, it's really bad. And so there was a really strong desire from a political perspective and a social perspective, economic perspective, to try and see where, you know, what are the main levers to trying to solve this problem. And so lots of small business development was looking at how do you create a, you know, an enabling environment for entrepreneurship and small business development and all that sort of thing. But the education, well, the person who was heading up this task team, Dr. Teddy Blecher, who is if anybody wants to go and look up his bio or look up his LinkedIn, he's a really remarkable visionary maverick who himself has started universities and schools and so on to really empower young Black South Africans. Is really his passion. And so he was sort of sought out as the person to be driving this. And he basically said, well, you know, the education system is there to prepare young people for something, for education, for marks, for results, for whatever it is, but it's a system that every child goes into. And so it's clearly, from a transversal perspective, not providing what the world of work is requiring, because all these young people are unemployed. So there's definitely a disconnect. And so let's look at what the role of the education sector can do to solve the problem of youth unemployment. So that was really the kind of, as Teddy always talks about, one goal. Let's just be focused on one goal, and the one goal is to lower youth unemployment. And so how do you do that, and how do you make an educational system able to contribute to that problem of youth unemployment? And so initially the mandate was actually called Entrepreneurship in Schools. It was it took probably 7 or so years of research before there was a sector plan that was sent to the department. It went through all the various bureaucratic levels and was finally signed off by the Minister of Education in February 2018. And so it became a mandated task to go and find ways of embedding entrepreneurship in schools with a view to lowering youth unemployment. So that was, and it's a really amazing piece of work. And but one of the difficulties with that is that entrepreneurship by itself, and by entrepreneurship I mean running businesses when I talk about it from that perspective, is not going to solve the problem of youth unemployment, because we all know from all kinds of stats that small businesses, while they are the biggest employers, it is the biggest sector that employs the most people. So from that construct, it's a good idea. But the number of small businesses that fail and people who go into it, it doesn't follow that you just learn entrepreneurship in schools and then you'll become an entrepreneur and then youth unemployment will be solved. It just isn't going to work that way, particularly as South Africa has not got a very entrepreneurial culture. If you follow any of the GEM Global Entrepreneurship Monitor reports from 2002, we don't do very well. We're not an entrepreneurial nation on the constructs within that research framework. Anyway, and so I think one of the first tasks was to look at, well, what do we mean by entrepreneurship in schools? And what is the outcome that we really are looking for? And so we started to debate this issue, and we reframed the name to be called E cubed. And we actually have a little hand signal, because the 3 E's that we really wanted to look at was education, and not through education, but thinking of it as lifelong learning. So my educating of myself is the one. And the reason for that is 50% of young South Africans drop out before grade 12. So let's say 1 million start at the beginning of the year, only 500,000 actually get to the end of grade 12. And of that, you know, the stats are just appalling. How many fail? How many actually don't go to university? So it's just it's a really poor scenario. So education, really important. Employability. So when you go to school, you should come out at least being able to be employable. And so that's where the competencies come in. What does, you know, like the Tony Wagner's achievement gap book, you know, what are we looking for in terms of what the world of work is requiring? So that's the employability side. And then the third one is entrepreneurship. So how do you start a business, and can you start a business? And yes, you should be starting a business if you have a great idea that's sustainable. So those are the 3 E's. But as a basis underneath that, we really started to focus on what are the drivers, what is the intrinsic motivation that is common, or should be common, in all 3 of those domains. And that's where we built in the notion of the entrepreneurial mindset, because it is the entrepreneurial mindset that drives all 3 of those. The elements of an entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial mindset is really the thing. And so we started to really research what does that mean, and what is the entrepreneurial mindset. And obviously, you know, the work that Eli's doing and so on, all sort of fed into that, and lots of readings, but very little being done on entrepreneurial mindset in schools, in the education sector. Lots of work around entrepreneurs, some work on entrepreneurial mindset, but not really in schools. So that's an area which really is I suppose, our point of departure. And we haven't found in the research any other great role models in other countries where the entrepreneurial mindset as an imperative, as the point of departure, the sort of golden thread, is present in any education system that is certainly not a national system. There are hundreds and really excellent entrepreneurship projects being done in schools, but not that are being embedded in the teaching for learning approach in the classroom. And so that's what we were, and I've got lots to tell you about that. But so the 2 kind of things I know probably people listening will want: how do you do it in a system? And also, what are you doing in the system? And I think those are 2 different questions, because one's an institutionalization kind of question, and the other is more of a teaching for learning approach, or pedagogical question. So I'm just going to take a break there in case you want to target a question to me, but there's lots more to say.
Yeah. This is fascinating. So I want to dig in, like, what is teaching for learning? I mean, that just seems like, you know, that seems like an obvious statement. I mean, that's why you teach, so people can learn. I mean, but
you'd be surprised how not obvious that is, Gary.
I understand. But you know, this goes back to the learned helplessness thing, I guess, that I was nibbling around the edges of. But you know, I don't think it's clear the way that routinized, other directed education can stifle the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. And that's, you know, when we make these trait-based assumptions about entrepreneurship, that allows us to continue to organize learning systems, you know, to continue to be oblivious to the extent to which what I would call like routinized, other directed learning interferes with the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. I mean, I think that's part of the challenge, you know, that there's a paper published by the World Economic Forum some years ago in which they said, you know, it's not enough add entrepreneurship on the perimeter, that it needs to be at the core of the way education operates. And I gave a talk in Zagreb a few weeks back, and I'm asking the question, like, well, why aren't there any courses in university that say employee mindset 101, let's say? The reason those courses don't exist because that is already at the core of the way education operates. Right. And so, mindset is our deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs and assumptions. The deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs and assumptions that influence our behavior without our awareness. And I would say our collective mindset is culture.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. And so, these assumptions that are so deeply embedded in our individual and collective conscience that the moment we set foot in grade 1, it is assumed that we're going to be an employee, that we're going to work in an established organization. We learn to assume that someone else will determine what we need to learn and do in order to become successful. And that assumption can leave us very, very helpless in the absence of an employer who is willing to pay a stable wage, a living wage, and so on and so forth. So I don't know, that's kind of where the learned helplessness thing comes in, that people are very bright, that it has nothing to do with like your level of intelligence. And this is the thing I've learned about, following the underdog entrepreneurs. It's not really about your credentials or your IQ or your personality traits. It's about how you think. It's not about what you know, right? Yeah. So, but let me come back to the other idea here is.
Can I make a comment on Kathleen's comment in the
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments, Kathleen. I'm just noting them as Gary's speaking. One of the comments was the United States being historically focused on STEM, which is counter to the entrepreneurial mindset. And I think that's very true. And it's similar in South Africa. And that even before grade 1, we generally trained out of our creativity. And thank you so much for posting that, because that really is exactly something that I wanted to talk about. And I think it hopefully links a little bit with what you were saying, Gary. And I think it was actually you put me onto George Land's work on his creativity tool. And correct me, and Nick will probably correct me if I get this wrong. But Kathleen, just to sort of underpin what you're saying, is he did this study. I think it was 1,600 children from the ages of 5. He tracked the same students at the age of 5, 10, and 15. And I think it was something like 240,000 adults. It was a big survey. And he'd been asked by NASA actually to use his creativity tool to find creative engineers and scientists. And apparently it worked really well. And then he thought, okay, well, let me try this on kids. And so he did this longitudinal study. And when they did the creativity test when they were 5 years old, they scored 98%. When they were 10 years old, they scored 30%. When they were 15 years old, they scored 12%, and the average and the adults on average scored 2%. So as I think it was Gary or somebody was telling me that actually what that tells you is at age 5 you start school roundabout, and actually so you're already 98% creative when you hit school, and then you actually unlearn all your creativity by the time you leave school, and then when you're an adult you have none. So you have 2%. So I mean, it's just such a profound indictment on the schooling system that a young person will enter school usually highly creative, and then we just systematically unlearn that. And I wanted to just touch on that point because we've done quite a bit of work on this, Gary, and it's been a really interesting journey for us as we've been trying to do. By the way, our relationship with the Department of Education is from 2018 to 2030 is our mandate time. And we have these kind of arcs and so our first arc is a research arc to the end of next year, where we really are trialing and testing and speaking to people and collaborating and trying to develop a bespoke model and so on. So it's very much a trialing and testing and iterating kind of period. And so that we don't put out something half-baked to 440,000 teachers ultimately. So this is a lovely, wonderful, wonderful time. And I work with an incredible team at eCubed who's doing this research and collaborating with amazing people around the world. We've had Kathy Hirsch-Paslik, who wrote this amazing book called Becoming Brilliant. If anybody wants to read it, it's really amazing. And she came onto one of our meetings the other day, and so we had direct access to these amazing thinkers, which is just really, really wonderful. And one of the organizations we've done a lot of work with is the Lego Foundation. Partly because what I didn't mention is we're actually also a nonprofit little institute. So we have our own, we raise our own funds, and which enables us to be kind of nippy and entrepreneurial, which is very nice, within the Department of Education, where we actually are an official agency as well. So, but to go back to this relationship that we're having with the Lego Foundation is really interesting, because they've done a whole lot of research on how learning happens, and particularly around the body of knowledge around the science of learning, which I really would encourage anybody that's interested to go and do some reading on, because of amazing, amazing work, which really brings in a whole lot of what was originally kind of siloed ways of looking at learning and looking at educating children in sort of either psychological or physical or educational, so on. And the science of learning brings it together with the whole child at the center, really, and looking at how do people learn and how do children learn. And so they have these, we've also sort of we've kind of added to this through various other research that we're doing, and looked at what are the characteristics that really activate learning. And because, as you've said many times, Gary, that human beings have an intrinsic motivation to learn. As soon as you boom out the womb, boy, you better learn to breathe, and you better learn to suckle, and you better learn to, stand up or crawl and stand up, and all those things that you just learn to do. And in that process, and this is where we do some really interesting research around how does the entrepreneurial behaviors start to show themselves at that age? Because of course, as we all know, it's self-evident that children ask, I don't know, what is it, 40,000 questions by the time they're 5 or something. There's some research that's done, but anyway, they ask a zillion questions, and they try things out, and they fail, and they try again, and they climb on a table and fall off, because then they take risks, and they seem to have, amazing self-belief in what they can achieve, and they're motivated by a goal to get somewhere. And so they have this innate sort of entrepreneurial behaviors, which I believe is a kind of mindset that's almost created through this process of learning through play. And so we've been doing a lot of research around this learning through play, and we so for us, the profound kind of aha was the purpose of schooling should be to perpetuate what already exists. Because what already exists is this amazing ability to discover, to search, to have a purpose, to try, to iterate, to fail, to ask people for help, which is what young people do. And then they come into school, boom, in rows, keep quiet, whatever. So the schooling, exactly as you describe it, Gary, is certainly not set up to perpetuate that. So we try not to use verbs like create or develop, because in fact, what you actually are doing is cultivating and catalyzing. And so you're actually wanting to sort of cultivate these traits that are already inherent and
tendencies,
innate.
yes,
tendencies, let's call them. And so anyway, and so this and then going back to what you were asking just now about teaching for learning. So we've been grappling with, how do you train teachers? What do you train them? How do you change teacher mindsets? How do you get to 440,000 teachers? And there's that whole notion of the teachers being the agents of this change, which of course they are. But we're thinking, okay, well, if the purpose of school is to perpetuate this playful environment that activates learning, then what is learning, and how do we get deep learning to actually happen in schools? And if it happens best through these characteristics of playful environment, then why not create that in the school system? Surely every class should be as close to creating the environment for activating characteristics of learning that come out of the science of learning and playful learning. Surely that should be what's in every class. And so we've developed an acronym, which is actually the word SPECIAL, which is actually also quite fun. So it's seven factors that are highly researched. You can go and do some wonderful research, and I can give you, Nick, I can send you maybe afterwards a whole lot of readings on this. So I'm very happy to share all the the bibliography and research that we've done. But anyway, the special environment is nothing profound, just like you were saying, Gary. It's like, it's a matter of kind of finding that simplicity and just putting it out there. And so the characteristics are that the learning variables should be socially interactive. So that's the S of special. It should create a sense of purpose. So that's the P. It should be enjoyable. And this is so important. There's so much research done on the joy. And I think, Gary, you also talk about the dopamine effect, of the joy of learning when you actually get something right and so on. Inspire curiosity, of course, because you can't possibly see a problem or find a solution if you're not curious about what's out there. Right. Encourage iteration. And so schooling just does not do this. Like, you get 35% for your test, and sorry for you, that's the end of that, move on, because there's more stuff coming. So you never iterate really enough to be doing really deep learning. Fostering active engagement. So that's the A. And so that there's this ongoing active engagement, and creating, we call them learners in South Africa, the students, but creating learner autonomy. So that's this agency, this being able to have this self-directed learning. And so those are the 7 SPECIAL, which we are building as a kind of a construct, or let's say our principles of our teaching for learning. So if you're teaching for learning, for deep learning, what is the conducive environment that you need to have in place to ensure that you perpetuate and sustain what is known to be researched as the best environment for learning? And so we're also integrating that, the whole sort of input of the entrepreneurial mindset, and we're doing some lovely research on the sort of both the inputs of the entrepreneurial mindset and also the fact that that's the outcome we're looking for. So we're looking for this entrepreneurial, and I acknowledge you on that, Gary, because it's a noun that we love to use, because it's like the word millennial. I am a millennial, but I am an entrepreneurial, and what does that mean? It's, as you say, it's somebody from the search and discovery generation, and I'm a searcher and a discoverer, and I'm solving problems for the world, as COP26 has told us we need to do. So this creative, this conducive environment for learning. The wonderful thing about it, Gary, and I'll stop because I've got so much to say, but I don't want to be talking too much. But is that it's not dependent on expensive resources. You can do this across any environment. So one of our key fundamentals in our system is that we have to try and create equality and an equitable, equal access quality education system, because in South Africa, unfortunately, it's so disparate, and it's really almost perpetuating what existed in the apartheid time, which is really absolutely iniquitous after 27 years of post-apartheid time. And so it's the wonderful thing about this approach is it doesn't require iPads or access to connectivity. Of course, if you have that, it obviously adds a huge value. But if a teacher can understand the importance of creating an environment that stimulates learning through it being enjoyable, through you socially interacting with your mates, through iteration, through all those things that I said, and you just create that environment, the English teacher does not have to get up and go and make the tea, because she or he can. I remember that my kids always say we could do a poem. You don't do a poem, but anyway, you do your poem in a special environment. You are perpetuating this, all these characteristics that are activating learning. We happen to also use a learning approach, which is project-based learning, because it's based on the design system principles of inquiry and problem solving, and then designing a product, which is a very wonderful teaching approach. which activates special very nicely. And it also is interdisciplinary opportunities and, across subjects and so on. And it has an outcome of a product, of a solution of something and so it's a very nice, but we often say that you can actually take out that and replace it with Montessori, for example, or, some other teaching approach that may be equally able to sit very well. In fact, anything sits on the special environment because it's just an environment, but particularly should be able to activate the competencies we're looking for. And so the competencies, so we actually have a tree behind me. We have the tree, which is just our little model. And so our little model is that the soil really is the science of learning. It's this body of knowledge, and within this very fertile soil of all that is made up in the science of learning are the roots, and the roots are the special. So if you have a solid special environment of those roots, then the trunk of the tree can really be any appropriate teaching approach. We use project-based learning and we really like it. It works really well for many, many reasons, which I could go into. It also, the projects mirror the reality of the learners' environments and so on. So, and then the branches are the competencies. So what are we looking for? We're looking for competence. We're looking for, creative innovation. We're looking for collaboration, all those things. And there's lots of talk about, is it 6 C's, 7 C's, 4 C's, whose C's are we looking at? Anyway, there's lots of work being done on that. And we're busy currently doing our own sort of bespoke C's, like we did our own special out of the work of the Lego Foundation and others. So anyway, but those are the competencies. And then the kind of fruit of that is the entrepreneurial. We want there to be entrepreneurials leading the system. And so we were trying to get to the simplicity on the other side of what is actually highly complex. And the sort of overriding thing, and this is a really, really important element, which I just want to emphasize, we actually have that as a kind of canopy over the whole thing, besides the equality, is the creation of a psychologically safe environment. Because if you're not in a psychologically safe environment where you can take a risk to put up your hand and ask a so-called stupid question, and if you're shut down by the teacher because you're asking a silly question, or you're making a noise, or nobody asked you for a hand, or the way the teaching is often traditionally done is not conducive to feeling psychologically safe. And certainly is the case in South Africa's history of the way education is done. I mean, we, as I said earlier, we had corporal punishment in my day. It was just shocking, because it's really kind of a fear environment of keep quiet, sit in a row, speak when you're spoken to, certainly don't come up with a creative idea that's out of the rubric box, And so to try and create a system where even children are confident enough just to ask a question, if you can just get every child to ask one question every day and realize that there's no stupid question, and start to get them to be able to be feel safe. You can never get them to be curious enough to be have the confidence to start thinking critically and creatively if they're not in a psychologically safe environment. So that's it's almost like a killing assumption. If you don't have that, you might as well go home, because the rest is not going to happen. And so that's the little kind of model that we are working on. And let me just say once again, we are trialing it, testing it, working with lots of organizations in the country, little sandboxes of schools and so on, and various cohorts of different, and also obviously different mechanisms. Like with the COVID, we obviously everything had to go online, and there was a whole lot of issues as well, obviously, and to create a special environment and a technological environment, how do you do that? And so we've got a lot of logistical and implementation challenges, but we really are working hard on getting a very robust model, if you like, or approach, to make sure that when we do land all these other challenges on it, at least this teaching for learning approach is solid and is understood. We have we talk about the heart, head, and hands. And so it's the whole heart, the buy-in, the understanding, the realization of the changing role of the teacher, and the teachers have to buy in to get that. And then the head, which is understanding, well, what is the science of learning? What is special? What is a project-based, learning approach, etc.? What are competencies? What am I looking for? How do I assess it? How do I plan my lesson on a Monday morning? What does my classroom look like? So there's all that knowledge of those things. And then there's actually the doing, okay, now when I get to school on Monday morning, what do I actually do? So that we have a whole approach to, over time, hopefully, if we get it right, is to be able to embed that, but we can't embed something that's not highly researched, evidence-based, robust, able to withstand debate, able to be part of the discourse around what's an appropriate education system that appropriately prepares learners for the 21st century VUCA world, as they call it. So anyway, sorry, I've spoken for way too long. Let me hold back and
no, it's good.
Questions. Yeah,
it's good. And there was a question earlier I wanted. Well, there's something I want to talk about. Like, so Armin is asking us, a parent, how do I foster curiosity in a child? And I want to try to address that question more broadly than just a parent to child, because the answer for the parent to child is the same for a teacher, employer, anyone, in my view. And I think people need to, like, as educators, we need to remind ourselves that humans are no different than any other mammal, and that we're all born with the innate desire and the capacity to learn whatever we need to learn to adapt and thrive in our environment. And I've been thinking about this for a while, Margie. And you said something to this effect earlier. And I'm going to tie a couple of these questions together with Kathleen's question about STEM. It's not like by teaching entrepreneurial mindset, we're not trying to teach everyone to become an engineer. We're appealing to something that's already innate in every human. The desire to fulfill human needs through our own effort is universal. It's a very, very powerful motivating force that's within every human being. And so to Armin's question, the creativity, you don't have to foster the creativity, it's natural. You have to not kill it. And
exactly.
I'm the last person you would expect this from, but I would push back a little bit on the idea that we can't lay the lack of creativity solely at the feet of education. I mean, we do it to ourselves. Our brains rely on heuristics and mental models and shortcuts. We try to navigate life by reducing, the cognitive strain. And so we want to simplify everything. We want to just rely on heuristics, and it takes a lot of effort to be creative and to stop and think and reevaluate. So education certainly plays a big role in the cultivation or the thwarting of creativity, but I don't think it's fair to say that it's all in education. But another point I want to come back to, Margie, and hopefully we have more questions around this idea. But this quote from Richard Shull, I've been thinking about this for a while, in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which I posted in there so I can read it accurately, in which he wrote in the foreword to The Pedagogy of the Oppressed: education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. Now, I think Shaw got it wrong. He's misframing it. I don't think it should be framed as an either or conversation. We have to bring the younger generation into the logic of the present, but we can do that without the conformity piece, right? I mean, I think, we have to explain to the younger generation, here's what we know about the world, but we don't know everything. And the world's kind of messed up, and we've messed it up. And you, younger people, can see things that we can't see. And that's so I think it's not an either or, it's a yes and conversation. And the last thing I'll say on this, Margie, I think the solution is to introduce discovery learning. And that's what your special model really is. You still need the transfer of explicit knowledge. We still have to do that.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. But I think if in the margins, if we can introduce what I'm calling entrepreneurial discovery learning, which is like expeditionary, right? It's off trail, like go outside of known systems and figure out how to identify and solve problems without the guidance of a professional teacher with a predictable outcome and an established curriculum. Figure out how to make yourself useful in uncertain, ambiguous environments. I think that's really, we can introduce that.
Yeah, I think that's, it's absolutely, that's what, the entrepreneurials are of the search and discovery generation. That's why we're kind of foregrounding that as the outcome we're looking for. But, to add some of the complexity to this, until we are all playing the same end game, it's very tricky because, for example, assessment currently at the moment is in the form certainly in South Africa of examinations, which you have to get a certain mark for, and then if you get that certain mark, you get entry into the tertiary system. And the tertiary system looks for those marks, and that's, you either make it or you don't, and then they perpetuate that same thing by, certain marks. So you got to get, so that's like playing, let me not say rugby because that's a South African game, but let's say, I don't know, baseball or something. So it's a particular kind of game. Then you say, okay, no, now you must actually change that and play a different game. It's also got a scoring system. It also uses a ball, but actually it's a different whole scoring mechanism. And so until we're all playing in the same game, it's very difficult to be saying to teachers, for example, teach this way in a special environment using project-based learning, and then assess these 21st century competencies, because that's really what the world needs after school. And the teachers are going, yeah, but what about matric exams? Because actually right now, that's all I'm interested in. I'm just going to get my kids through and make sure they can carry on in the system. And so there needs to be a kind of worldwide shift, which I think is starting to happen. There are universities that don't require grade point average anymore. They don't even have, certificates of grading anymore, because it's such a shifting, changing world that how can you grade? How can you actually give a mark to something when the something doesn't exist anymore, actually, because the world's moved on? So I think there is a conversation, but the deeply institutionalized systems of education, both tertiary and secondary and primary, are so embedded in the logistics of the buildings and the bells and the timetable and the length of the period and the curriculum amount of content you've got to get in a certain period of time. And it's really difficult, because you've got to have tremendous courage as a policymaker to throw that out and say, well, actually, that's completely irrelevant, because actually it's easier. You have the kids come in, they sit in rows, they shut up, they're quiet for a period of time. Parents going to go off and work while they're doing that. We'll look after your kids for a bit. Yes, maybe they'll learn something. I mean, I know I'm being cynical, but you know what I mean? The system is set up to almost be easier. And, I had a horrible experience the other day when my own child was telling me about she's at university now, but she was, they now are learning obviously online, and the examinations are online. And so the marking is done by a computer now, because it's easy, because it's all got to be online. And so none of the workings, it was a chemistry, I think, or some paper that she was writing, it was just, if you got the answer, you got it right, because the marking system was easier for the teachers that way than it was to delve back and find, well, there's obviously logic in this, so you've got to give some credit for the thinking process behind it. And I just thought, oh my word, that's exactly what schooling does. It finds the easiest system to manage scale and to manage lots of kids in the class and whatever. And the easier you can make it true, false, or a rubric that's easy to mark or whatever. And so it's not about what's optimum. It's like that lovely Vygotsky thing of the zone of proximal development for every child. Where is that perfect sweet spot between challenge and boredom? And how do you activate the individual child? And the schooling system is just a mechanized system of managing mass education. And until we can change that game and say, how do you know that a child, like that lovely quote, I think it was Jamie Cassidy said it, I'll be happy when my child comes home unhappy with his empathy mark. And that is brilliant, because that's exactly what I only got 60% for empathy. I think I'm much more empathetic than that. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing if that was the focus, where we were starting to look at other outcomes other than, and please, for those listening on this, I'm absolutely not saying we don't need algebra and knowledge. There's tons of models that we are building into the system that absolutely activates the necessity for knowledge. So it isn't about that, but it's about the holistic person's preparedness for life after school, with the knowledge, but with all those other competencies that you need to thrive and flourish. And we use a lot of Seligman's flourishing, by the way, in a world that's very, very challenging, but that requires innovation to solve the problems of the 21st century, which are very different to the 20th century and the 19th century, which is actually where education is currently located. And so until we change that game, and particularly from an assessment perspective, where we stop forcing these poor teachers to have to, I mean, there's one system in South Africa that has 12 years of schooling in this fantastic schooling situations, kind of Rudolf Steiner, Montessori type thing. And then they have a 13th year, train them up quickly to be able to write the matric exam. So that year is specifically to, okay, don't worry about all this other stuff for now. We just do this one quick year so that you can make sure you enter the rest of the system not compromised, because we don't do that other stuff in the 12 years. So, I mean, that's the kind of way around, which I think is probably the best of, a bad world, but at least they're sticking to their like principles of this is how learning happens. We're going to do that for 12 years. And then, yes, we know you've got to go play a different game. So with different rules. So we'll just quickly teach you how to play that game, you'll be fine. And then, but I mean, it just shouldn't be like that, And so we're doing some fantastic work with universities around looking at those things too, which is exciting. Yeah.
The thing that also occurred to me, Margie, is the attitudes and skills required to excel in academia are pretty much distinct from the attitudes and skills required to succeed as an entrepreneurial.
100%.
And I just wrote a piece about this, and Nick, maybe you can find it and post it about like, what does the future hold for kids that don't do well in school? And we don't have the unemployment problem you have. We have a serious dropout problem. And what I've said in this piece is that you should think about teaching these young dropouts to think like entrepreneurials. And one of the point I'm trying to make here is this, Margie. I've interviewed, I don't know, hundreds of entrepreneurs, and my interest is in the underdog, the everyday entrepreneur. I'm not interested in the unlikely entrepreneurs. I'm not interested in the machinations of Elon Musk's brain or what he does. I'm fascinated with people who start with nothing, who have no particular advantage in life. And what I see as a pattern is a lot of these entrepreneurs, they're not great students in the traditional sense, yet they seem to be thriving as entrepreneurials. And so how do we reconcile that? And part of what I observed in these entrepreneurials, they're learning machines, but they're just not learning through traditional means necessarily.
Gary, it's purpose. It's about purpose.
That's really what it is.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the beginning of the conversation. I'm so frustrated. Like, the definitions of entrepreneurship are all about risk in exchange for profit. That's so misleading. I mean, yes, there are some entrepreneurs that are strictly driven by profit, but that's not what I've seen. And to overlook the purpose component, and you and I've talked about this many times, this is where this becomes so relevant to education, that exposure to entrepreneurial experiences creates a very, very powerful incentive to learn.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I think what the work that you're doing is as the work we are doing is to help educators understand how to coach students to search for the intersection between what they're naturally interested in what they're naturally capable of becoming good at, and the needs of other humans. Like in that intersection of those three spheres, let's say, we tap into the most potent form of human motivation.
Yeah.
And as an educator, you know, once that happens, your job becomes very easy.
Yeah, exactly. You're the guide on the side, you're the scaffolder, you're the whatever. You're not the sage on the stage, as they say. But Gary, going to that notion of purpose, I think I've told you this example before, but I will share it. When I was running actually your course when I came back to South Africa, and so this is sort of apropos of the notion of purpose. And I was running it for a group of people, and there was one particular woman there who was very demotivated and very not one of those difficult people to work with in a classroom, because there's not a lot of energy and kind of sucking the oxygen out the room. And as we were going through this process, I noticed a change in her. And actually, I at one point thought maybe she was in love or something, because she looked so different. She was completely different. Anyway, and she said, no, she's thinking of resigning because she's got all these incredible business ideas. And I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. It was something miraculous that happened to this woman. She literally, her light bulb had been switched on, and in this process of doing the Ice House course. And but the point of what really happened was, one of her little business ideas that she had required her, it was a sort of a little exporting business that she was running, and she was not an academic at all, but she needed to understand the tax and the excise and export legalities around this business that she was running. And so she had this huge book of complicated stuff, and she said, oh, Margie, you won't believe it, I'm going to have to read this by Monday because I've got to be able to do blah blah blah. Now, if I had said to her, I'm going to call her Jane. Jane, by Monday, you've got to go and read this book. I'm going to test you on it. She'd be like, what? Why?
Yeah,
she was completely motivated and driven to understand that, because she was driven by purpose, because that was the next hurdle she needed to get over to achieve this goal, this thing that she was trying to achieve. And so if we can, that's why I love project-based learning that we're using as this teaching for learning approach, the trunk of our tree. Because it places the solution to a problem at the center, and usually as much as we can, that problem being something that's relevant to the age of the child or the state or the community or the environment of the child, so that they're motivated to go and find the knowledge they need to be able to get to so they go through the inquiry stage and the problem solving stage and then the design stage, and they actually then have to go and present there has to be an outcome, there has to be a product or an outcome at the end of the day, but they have to have this information. And so they become hungry for knowledge. It's a pull approach rather than a push approach, which is normally what education is, like push the child to try and finish. But now it's like, where can I find the information? Then you don't say, no, sorry, that's grade 8 information. You're not allowed that yet because you're only in grade 7. Like, what? No, but I need it now because I need to be able to solve this problem. And so it takes away this ridiculous kind of notion that at a certain age you can step up to the next, because it's obviously like human beings are evolving creatures. So that's why I'm saying the system of education, unfortunately, it is a very long-term challenge, because the institutionalization and the actual structure of the way education, and I'm not talking about South Africa at all, I'm talking about worldwide, has to somehow try and shift. And there's amazing little pockets of incredible things that are happening around education. But for us in South Africa, we have a system. We have to make that system work. We've got to find solutions to this. Students who are not staying in school, they're not engaged in their learning. They don't see any reason to be learning. They drop out whenever at the opportunity they can, because it's not fun. Why would you go to school which is just not stimulating you? And so that's why, just going back to that whole special environment, if you can create a joyful environment, one that's socially interactive, that's driven by a meaningful project that you're dying to find information to solve. And if you do that year on year for 13 years, by the time you've done that over and over and over again, you've honed your competency skills so that when you leave and you're in a situation where you've got to, solve a problem, you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to collaborate, or I'm going to try and iterate. And you've been using those tools all the time in your 13 years of schooling, and you come out honed in the ability to know which tools are appropriate for what particular context, and you just got much more chances of success. unfortunately in the just remembering stuff in exam and then forgetting it, it's not going to, that's not going to prepare you for life. So
I like what you just said, Margie, and Nick, please, if there are questions, interrupt me. But I found this term in a paper about discovery learning by Jerome Brunner, and he used this term that I fell in love with, it, the heuristics of discovery. That's what you're talking about. Like, by the time they leave school, they've developed some basic competencies around discovery.
Exactly.
Right. And that's what keeps alive the lifelong self-directed learning, the ability to learn and unlearn and relearn, and to walk into any situation and start looking for problems to be solved. I posted a link here. Paul Graham is one of the founders of Y Combinator. He's a brilliant essayist in my view. But he wrote this essay here about a project of one's own. And this is going back to Armin's question, and he's noticing he picked up his 9-year-old from school, and the kid's got a side project going on of his own. The kid can't wait to get home and get back into his.
Yeah.
And I think that's the answer, Margie. Whether you're a parent, like, my message to the parent is you can't rely on the school system. And so, encourage your students, Armin, encourage your children to undertake an entrepreneurial project of their own. Even if you're a teacher, outside of the mandate, encourage your students to undertake projects of their own.
And Gary, if I can add to that, create for them a special environment at home. So special as in those 7 characteristics, because that doesn't have to only be in a school environment. That can be in a home environment. You can set it up where you make the environment of their home learning or of their learning outside of school equally special, so that that you're activating those characteristics of learning that we've researched need to be in place. So if you're driven by this passion project, but you are also it's conducive in the home environment, that you're setting it up so that that it becomes the way lifelong learning happens. And that, yes, there's a responsibility of the schooling part of that pipeline to do it as best as possible, but there's the beginning part and the end, and the rest of it and if you can create the whole environment to be like that perpetuates the love of learning, the intrinsic motivation to learn, the innate what did you call them, aspects of a person to learn in all
innate
around
tendencies.
Innate tendencies. Yeah, thank you. And then you get to that notion of culture, as you're saying, Gary, where it becomes the culture, where it's psychologically safe to take risks. And I know that the history of America, not so much recently, but in the beginning, was this melting pot of the sort of unbridled access to innovation and trying things. And it was, I don't want to make any value judgments on any country, but it certainly was a very entrepreneurial nation for exactly because the reasons that it was culturally acceptable to try and fail and start a business and try another one and so on.
Yeah. And there's a term that I'm using a lot lately, Margie. I use it in this piece. It's like error-based learning.
Yes, exactly.
Like, that's what's essential for innovation and discovery. So it's like, it's error, and then discovery.
Right, exactly.
And that's
iteration. Yeah.
And
exactly.
and the focus on efficiency is the enemy of innovation. The obsession with efficiency and productivity is the enemy of discovery. And I think that's an important part of the conversation, is that that's what discovery learning is. And it's error-based learning. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, but you're going to discover things. And that's how it happens. And we're
exactly. And as Kathleen says, failure is okay. And the problem is the very word fail is you know, did you pass or fail? Did you get whatever the pass mark is? And fail has such a terrible negative connotation. I am a failure. Well, no,
Right.
you're not actually a failure. You haven't. And, you know, this is where I you know, I have a problem with rubrics and so on. It obviously depends. I mean, some cases there is the right answer, obviously. But there's the journey to getting to the right answer. That's a process of learning. And that's why I is in our special, which is iteration, you know, do something, do it again, try it again, you know, and it's in that process of failing or making an error that you get to the discovery, obviously. And so somehow we've got to change the language we use around this notion of did you fail or did you pass, and it's embedded in our society. I mean, it's absolutely embedded. I failed maths. No, you didn't fail maths. You just didn't get the answer this time around. Next time, you know, it's the whole yet notion.
You either win or you learn.
Yeah, exactly. You either win or you learn. Exactly. So anyway, so that's why, you know, changing a systemic thing is very hard. And just going back to maybe some of the questions in people's minds, I just want to give credit to the South African Education Department, because they are, from a political perspective and a bureaucratic perspective, very motivated to change the system. And it might not look like it from the results that are coming out and from, you know, the massive challenges that this agency, you know, has within the South African government system. But there's an incredible desire by very, very visionary leadership in the top of the South African education system. And we are enormously grateful for our Director General, who's just remarkable, Mr. Mweli, who is just so passionately motivated to for the good of young people in South Africa. And so the fact that they've even created this unit that we are, this E-cubed unit, to try and find innovative ways, and are listening to some of the recommendations. Our recommendations will be at the end of next year, but already the support that they're giving us at district level, the 88 districts in the country, to trial and test and to start making changes. And even in the official assessment process at the end of grade 9, there's an so-called exit exam, but it's really actually also to do your streaming for grades 10, 11, and 12, where you can choose different subjects and so on. So, but you can get a certificate at grade 9, and it's a sort of official. We don't like to say that it's when you can leave school, because we obviously want to try and encourage everyone to stay in school, but it is a kind of an assessment milestone. And they are bringing in project-based and competency-based assessment in that at that grade, which is phenomenal, because for the first time, it's not based on the normal assessment of marks. And they've asked us to help them design the projects for that sort of exam, that assessment process, which is amazing, because it's a real indication of a desire to start shifting, both from a parent's perspective, but also a systemic perspective and a tertiary education perspective, just exactly how one should be assessing competence. And so this whole notion of what is competence-based education is very, very important, because once those competencies become accepted, like that quote I was saying about, I'm upset with my empathy mark. You know, if empathy is one of the competencies, or it's a characteristic, if you like, of somebody, then that's got to be something that's got to be foregrounded in how you build it into the teaching for learning approach, as well as how you assess whether there's been any kind of shift in that, which is radically different from, you know, here's the rubric for something you just to memorize for an exam, you know, teaching for the test, or where Kathleen, you said something, what is it called in America? Learning for the test.
Teaching for the test. Yeah.
You know, yeah, exactly.
You and I both spoke at the Ignite Africa conference. I think that was a week ago. Last week, I'm a little bit turned upside down. But one of the themes, and you know, I used Desmond Tutu's quote about, you know, in which he said, at some point we have to stop pulling people out of the river, and we have to go upstream and find out why so many people are falling in. Yes. And I took that quote and turned it inside out, Margie, and I said, you know, when it comes to entrepreneurial development, it's not enough to just be supporting people who self-identify as entrepreneurs. We have to go upriver and find out why so few are jumping in the river. Right? Exactly. I mean, that's the way to think about. Yeah. You know, I mean, you and I have talked about this for years, but I mean, in my research, I've come to believe that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned.
Exactly.
That these innate tendencies of curiosity, of growth, of competency, the need for autonomy, the desire to fulfill human needs through our own effort, that's in every single person. And that we don't realize the extent to which we're training people to become employees.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big idea. I'm so excited about.
Just to say it, Gary, I just want to distinguish between what you said there and our employability. So the employability is, am I able to be employed? And in fact, do I even have what current employees are looking for in terms of competencies in the current employment kind of world? So, which is different to what you're saying, which is the employee mindset of, that external locus of control and being purely directed by external guidance, which is very different to. So I just wanted to make that distinction, because that's not what we're saying in our in our employability.
Right.
E. Yeah.
Right.
So, sorry,
and it goes back to. No. It goes back to my definition of entrepreneurship, which is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others.
Right. Exactly.
By creating value for others, we empower ourselves, and by I mean empowering in a very broad way. It's not just economic empowerment. It's more about holistic. It's about flourishing. It's about psychological well-being, and so forth. Yeah. Nick, are there any? We have just a few minutes left, and Margie, I feel like we could go on for hours with this conversation.
I can't believe the time's up already.
I know. It's been a really fascinating, great conversation. Just a couple cleanup questions, Margie. If we can turn the clock back an hour and a half. Katie was asking. You mentioned being part of a foundation, and she caught it as something August Foundation. I don't know.
Okay. It was the Ellen Gray.
Oh, okay. That's what I figured out.
Yeah, so it's ORBIS is what she thought was August. So it's Ellen Gray Orbis Foundation. Yeah.
Nick, you can put
so
in there.
Ellen Gray is sort of like our he's an amazing philanthropist and ran an incredible company, and now gives most of his wealth towards the empowerment of youth in South Africa, actually, and around Africa, not just in South Africa. So yeah, he's our kind of Warren Buffett, if you know.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I'll put a link to their main website.
We've done a lot of work with Ellen Gray.
And just to distinguish from Ellen Gray Limited, which is his investment, his kind of main company. So it's the Ellen Gray Orbis Foundation.
Yep.
And then their philanthropy, various other things that he does, which is amazing.
Oh yeah. Another distinction that was being made by several of the Southern Africans, not the Safis or the Saffers. Who are on. Most of this conversation, and this is just for everyone context, most of this conversation was revolving around specifically South Africa, the country, not Southern Africa, the region. There were a couple of people who wanted to make that distinction because there are similar but distinct problems in the region. While South Africa specifically had apartheid, there were other forms of post-colonial oppression going on throughout the area and things of that nature. So definitely wanted to highlight that because it's worth noting that while cultures can be similar, they are distinct and different and therefore have their own challenges. There was another cleanup point I wanted to highlight. That was it. Well, and there's an unanswered question from Jobert or Jobert, not positive on pronouncing your name, which is the unentrepreneurial nature of South Africans and how can education undo that cultural construct. I think we've hit on that inadvertently throughout this conversation, but I did want to highlight that as maybe a rhetorical question for us to think about, because a lot of what we've talked about, from the roots to the trunk to the canopy and the fruit, as you laid it out, Margie, are a great starting point anyway to shift how education can then change the overall culture.
Exactly. Thanks. That was a good summary, Nick.
Thank you. Other than that, if anyone else has any other questions, like Gary mentioned, we have been recording this. I'll be sending a follow-up within 12 to 24 hours. With this recording, I'll include the the chat file as well. Someone asked for that because of all the
That's useful.
helpful links and quotes. And then if you have any follow-up questions, you can respond to that email to me, and I can forward those on to Gary and Margie.
Perfect. Thanks so much,
Awesome.
Nick.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Armin just asked for our definition. I just typed it in there very quickly. Our
Perfect.
definition of
Thank you.
entrepreneurship. I appreciate you asking for that, Armin. It took me 25 years to land at that conclusion. It really did. I've been thinking about this for a long time. But what I love about this definition is that anyone can embrace that definition. That's a simple definition. Like, the more useful you become, the better off you're going to be. And,
Yes.
and so in our work, you know, what I want to make this point, maybe as a closing point. In our work, we're not advocating that people drop out of school, quit their jobs, and go start businesses. What we are advocating is that we use our discretionary thought, time, resources to explore on the margins new ways to make ourselves more useful to more humans. And that's a question, you know, when I speak at universities or to, you know, broader groups, that's the question I love to ask people. What is preventing you from making yourself more useful to more humans? And these are questions that are designed to sort of illuminate your own beliefs that might be holding you back, that are self-imposed,
Right.
you don't even know you have. And you know, Margie, this will be another 90-minute conversation, but I wrestle with this, like, entrepreneurship as a means of empowerment is really, really a big idea.
It really is.
You can figure out how to make yourself useful. That's how you empower yourself.
Yeah, actually,
You don't need someone else to credentialize you or whatever. You can figure out how to make yourself useful. But mindset is also a big deal. Like Gabor Mate said, like, first the world shapes your mind, and then your mind shapes you.
Yes, and your
Shapes
behaviors.
your world.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
I mean, the mindset component, the idea that there's all these deeply held assumptions that we acquired unconsciously that are now directing our decision making without our awareness, like, that should keep everyone up at night.
Yes.
Exactly. And I love the notion, and I can't find the quote. If you can find, I know, Nick, you're brilliant at finding quotes, and it might have been from you, but somebody said, and it might have been, anyway, I'm not sure it was, but about education being the hope for humanity. And I just love that, because, you know, if we can empower young people to, exactly as your definition says, is to be self-directed in the pursuit of opportunities to create value for others being, you know, whether it's your tiny circle of influence or if it's a massive, you know, impact of influence, by solving problems for others and therefore empowering oneself, is actually what gives us hope for humanity. So if we can have this Ubuntu-ness that I was talking about, this the gift to the world of human relationships that Steve Biko was talking about, what you're talking about in terms of the humanness of entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurial mindset and how that empowers you as an individual. And then there's the symbioticness of, I'm empowered as an individual, but I'm doing this, you know, to add value to others. And that has to be surely the hope for humanity. And if education can be the system that unlocks that in young people year after year after year after year, we could actually change the way we operate as people. So, you know.
I love that.
Yeah.
Let's just leave it there, Margie.
Yeah, okay.
But that's a doozy right there. Education can be a system that unlocks the untapped potential of people. I mean, that's really a beautiful place to end.
Yeah.
Margie, thanks so much for taking time out. I know it's late there, and you've had a long day.
Good, no problem.
I can't wait to see you again. I know you'll be back in the States soon. We got to find a way to get together and cause some kind of trouble.
I'm taking up on that, Gary. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. So thank you, Margie. Thank you, everyone, for being on this webinar. And Nick, thanks for being an awesome host.
Thank you. Nick.
Absolutely.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Margie.
Thanks, everyone on the call too. Thanks.
Ciao.
Bye.